First of all, thank you all so much for being here. We are very, very excited to have this conversation and very grateful for everyone who's taken out the time to be here for this and contribute to a conversation that is kind of difficult, but very much excited to get started and get into difficult topics. The intention today really is to explore how to leverage and adapt existing human rights due diligence practices and frameworks to address challenges in the global data enrichment supply chain. There's certainly been more media attention on the conditions of data enrichment workers across the global AI supply chain. And there's been a lot of amazing work from a number of scholars and other organizations in this field, some of whom are in this call today, and who have done a lot of great work to highlight the conditions under which workers are doing this work, and we've had the opportunity to learn from them. That being said, there is somewhat of a gap here because creating greater visibility for the conditions under which this work is being done hasn't necessarily translated into changing organizational practices across these supply chains. A lot of PAI's work over the last few years has focused on trying to understand what it takes to change practices in and between companies, which we have shared a little bit about in the concept note that you will have seen and some of the pre-reading materials. And we'll go over a little bit of this today to frame the conversation. That being said, as we have been doing this work and talking to more people, it's also become clear that while we've been trying to address challenges in the data supply chain that seem new, these aren't entirely unprecedented problems. There are a lot of lessons to be learned from how these types of challenges have been approached in other supply chains and industries, and we hope to bring insights from diverse stakeholders together to figure out how we can better work towards changing practices across the field. To that end, we're really interested in learning from existing tools, frameworks, and principles in human rights communities, which is why we are here today. And we're hoping that this will be the start of a dialogue of how to leverage the learnings from human rights due diligence practices and frameworks to address challenges in the global data supply chain. To that end, we are very excited to be partnering with the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, BTEC group, and OECD's Responsible Business Conduct for a group which is spearheading the due diligence guidance for trustworthy AI. And we're hoping to use our time today to outline the barriers and pathways to embed responsible AI data enrichment practices within the scope of human rights due diligence frameworks. We also hope to identify alignment between some of our work and our resources with that guidance and existing human rights due diligence practices. And we know that this is a big undertaking, so we might not reach any concrete solutions today, but we hope that this is going to be the start of a conversation, and we hope to follow up and have more sustained engagement to that end. So we're hoping to have a good conversation with everyone and engage more deeply with the community that is present today. Just to ground the conversation, you will have received an agenda ahead of time. We've set some of the intentions. We'll go over some of PAI's work in this area. Then we'll hear from Stephanie Seal from OHCHR and Rashad Abelson from the OECD. Then we'll have a panel which will feature perspectives on implementation and challenges. And then we'll have an open discussion. But to briefly go over some of the work and just to ground the conversation around what we're talking about, just reminder that high quality AI models are dependent on a massive amount of training data, which usually is not legible to algorithmic systems and requires a large workforce to label, structure, and enrich this data. There are a couple of reasons why we think that this is really important. First of all, responsible AI conversations sometimes focus a lot on deployment risks, but responsible AI should include both ethical development and deployment of AI. And this is a critical part of the development lifecycle. Second, this is also a great opportunity to build a more inclusive economy around AI. Oftentimes we hear a lot about job displacement and what the role will be of workers in our society, but this is a new job that's being created and we have the opportunity to make it a good job. Third, this is something that we are seeing becoming a bigger workforce. The demand for this type of work is growing. The nature of that demand is changing as we require more custom data and higher quality data and higher degrees of expertise to make sure that these models are higher quality. But we are seeing that this is not going away anytime soon. And fourth, the conditions under which data enrichment workers are doing this work impacts the quality of the underlying models and the safety and reliability of these models. And so we really believe that in order to make sure that these models are fit for purpose and truly represent humanity and human values and societal values in a way that we want them to, we should be training them with that in mind and making sure that we have uh, we have a proper representation of people. When we first started doing this work, we realized that we were seeing a lot of problems in the data enrichment supply chain, and workers were being impacted, but it wasn't clear what decisions were leading to those adverse impacts. And we started highlighting some of the decisions that were being made throughout the pipeline, and also some of the decision makers, but this wasn't really consistent across across organizations or even within organizations sometimes. And that meant that there needed to be a little bit more guidance as to what companies should be doing to improve conditions for data enrichment workers. Some of our early work in this area was really around defining the problem and developing multi-stakeholder informed recommendations. We had workshops back in 2020 where some of you were a part of those, and also had a white paper that highlighted what we wanted the industry to aim for. This was a 40-page theoretical white paper, and so coming from the industry, it's hard to understand what does it look like to actually put those into practice. And that led us to ask the question, what would it take to adopt those recommendations and see these in the real world? That led us into a phase of experimentation and testing and collaborating with some of our partners. Notably, we did a case study back in 2022 with DeepMind. You'll hear a little bit about that later today, and started figuring out what it would look like in an applied setting. And that was, we'll share a couple of the resources that came out of that work, and also some of the other work that we've been doing since then has included engaging with a broader group of stakeholders across different organizations who were similarly trying to implement these types of recommendations into their unique organizational contexts. We've been doing more research and partner engagement, working with our community of practice and hosting other workshops. We've also engaged more with policymakers over the last year and been refining our resources and exploring additional levers of change. So where are we right now? We have 5 guidelines. We have that listed on our website, which highlights what companies should aim to do. This is based off of our research and the white paper that we published. The guidelines are a 2-pager, a more readable version of this. And we also put together resources. This was something that we put together as a part of the DeepMind case study that was meant to help make it easier to meet those guidelines more consistently within the organization. Since then, and through the work that we've been doing with broader group of stakeholders and the community and through workshops, we've been looking at what does it really take for companies to be doing well. And so we've outlined a pathway, and you might have received a blog post about this earlier that we shared in the pre-reading materials around what we've been asking companies to do. The first of that is we want them to do the guidelines and implement those responsible practices. The second is introducing internal governance mechanisms. And that's to say that just saying that we're doing the guidelines is not enough. We also need to make sure that we're building out the capabilities for our teams to consistently meet those guidelines across an organization. So what do proper internal governance mechanisms look like to ensure consistency in upholding those types of guidelines? The third is promoting consistent practices across the supply chain. One of the findings that we had from one of our workshops in 2023 was that this isn't a single node problem. There's a lot of organizations that are involved in shaping the conditions for data enrichment workers, and it's really important to make sure that actors across the supply chain are working together in order to ensure that those practices are being met. The fourth is making sure that there's transparency in order to enable accountability and drive towards a better accountability ecosystem here. And the fifth piece is integrating workers' voices for iterating on data enrichment practices. We know that the nature of data enrichment work is changing rapidly, and all of our guidelines are not future proof. And so it is important to make sure that there's a meaningful way for workers' voices to be represented in shaping future iterations of best practices. Again, the whole point of this is to create create the conditions for a greater accountability ecosystem here from other stakeholders as well. Most recently, we've published two new resources that align with that number 3 and number 4 ask of the vendor engagement guidance and also the transparency template. This is meant to make it easier to to work with other organizations in your supply chain and also to figure out what to report on. We have put those together and we'll put that in the chat as well. And we're in a public comment period right now to try to understand, to try to get more feedback and more input into how to make these resources effective. And we would love to get more feedback on that. That's a very brief and rapid overview of some of the work that we've been doing in this area. And I would just want to say that I think we're really excited to figure out how to align some of the work that we're doing with existing human rights due diligence practices. And to that end, I will pass it over to my colleagues, first starting with Stephanie, to kind of provide her perspective so we can start to do some of that bridging work. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Sonam. Am I audible? Good. Okay. Excellent. Good to see you all here. There are many, many faces, some familiar, some less familiar, but it's good to see you all. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Stephanie Seal, and as Sonam mentioned, I'm with the UN Human Rights Project the BTEC project at UN Human Rights, and I'm based in California. So I just wanted to provide a little bit of background and sort of baseline setting for some of the human rights due diligence work and concepts that Sonam referred to before. So the BTEC project, for those of you who are unfamiliar, is an initiative based in the Business and Human Rights Unit in the UN Human Rights Office, also known as OHCHR. We're focused on applying the UN guiding principles on business and human rights to the tech sector. And we began around 6 years ago on this particular initiative, and we conducted consultations with a variety of stakeholders across the world involved in the global tech ecosystem. So this was industry, civil society, government regulators, academics, end users. And the objective really there was to understand how the human rights framework, notably the UNGPs, could be applied to digital tech and tech innovations. And what we learned was that the sort of the 3-pillar paradigm of the guiding principles, for those of you who are unfamiliar, we're looking at state responsibility to protect human rights, corporate responsibility to respect those rights, and then responsibility to provide access to remedy. That was all considered very challenging for those in the digital tech space, that sort of the breadth and the distribution of stakeholders, predominantly end users and employees, in the millions around the world. It was just too vast to kind of consider the application of the guiding principles. And so systemic human rights due diligence and risk assessment practices, as we were kind of familiar with, would be just too difficult in this context. So we set out to develop a project that had 4 different focus areas. The first 2 focusing on business responsibility, so looking at business models and the related risks, and then due diligence that are in the context of end use of a product or a solution. And then the second 2 would focus on states and other stakeholders' responsibilities, including access to remedy, and then a smart mix, which is sort of focused on the state duty to protect, and it's sort of a combination of corporate policy paired with regulatory action. So the primary addendum, I think, to all of this is that we decided not to address supply chain. We felt like it had been largely covered in traditional sectors, textile manufacturing, agribusiness, mining, and also computer hardware, which is where PAI's really groundbreaking work has come in. We're recognizing that with the advent of AI, sort of this new commodity, in a sense, that's so integral to the identification of training data and the development of large language models and whatnot, these data enrichment workers who really realize that these achievements and this work are just a key element in the supply chain. And with it, we really would need to review how to responsibly integrate kind of the process of data sourcing and cleaning and annotating all of that into existing due diligence practices. And so even more so now that with the advent of some legislation that's out, like the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which we'll talk about a little bit later in this session, we really needed to kind of get our ducks in a row. So with the BTech project, we've also been engaging investors in early stage companies to help them understand their responsibilities as companies under the guiding principles. And we're looking also at AI foundation models and products and tools. And I believe Sonam sent a link to one of the papers that we produced last year in our initial phase of the generative AI project, where we looked at rights-based approaches to development of AI products, including an attention to potential harms to people. So with the BTech project, our underlying ethos is really not to stifle innovation, but ensure that technology is designed and developed and deployed responsibly. And we're working with many of you all, many tech companies that are on the call today, to help to try to identify the challenges in this conversation. But then we're also eager to figure out what the opportunities look like and where the guiding principles can help offer guidance to define these human rights focused best practices. We're looking now kind of outside of just the end use context and looking at kind of how to consider responsible data enrichment as an input. The guiding principles being a globally recognized framework, I think, are useful because then AI companies can build upon standards, human rights standards, to address their own potential adverse impacts, really in kind of their own bespoke way, but in accordance with this global framework. And this, will jive with regulations and also this mandated due diligence that I talked about. But then also it can elevate what we believe are AI developers and deployers' intention to really be connected to technology that does support rights holders, including users and obviously now data workers. So we're just really eager to integrate our piece into this conversation and see what steps we can create kind of collectively, collective actions and goals that are really across the whole value chain. So brief remarks, we have a lot to get through today. So I'll hand it over, I think, to Rashad now, and to talk about some of the work that the OECD, which is a great partner of ours, is working on in this area.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rashad Abelson. I'm with the OECD Center for Responsible Business Conduct. We're the part of the OECD that works on developing and supporting the implementation of common government-backed standards on human rights, environmental, and labor due diligence. We're really happy to partner with Partnership in AI and the UN BTech project for this webinar. Allow me to just quickly tie in what we're discussing here, what we plan to discuss here, and with the work that the OECD is currently doing on RBC and digital technology. Our overarching international legal instrument that's really relevant for this topic is the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises on RBC, which complements the UNGPs and clearly sets out that governments expect companies to identify and address harmful impacts related to their operations, as well as impacts caused by business relationships in their supply chains through a process of supply chain due diligence. That due diligence process is outlined in detail in the guidelines and in other OECD RBC instruments. Many of you are probably already familiar with the RBC due diligence framework, so I won't go into too much detail on that here, but there are some aspects of it that I'd like to highlight, which I think tie in nicely to the conversation we're about to have. Number one, it's that businesses are expected to understand their operations and supply chains through an initial broad scoping exercise. Then number two is to assess the impacts of the company's involvement with what they identified in their scoping exercise, and then prioritize the most significant impacts to be addressed first. Right now, we're finalizing the development of a very detailed, what we hope to be practical due diligence guidance for responsible AI that covers all companies and AI value chains. And seeks to essentially take the step-by-step process of that RBC due diligence framework and explain how it applies to various companies across the AI value chain and to address various risks across the AI value chain. Right now, we're in the final stage of the development of that guidance. As part of this process, we worked with experts to identify what the most significant impacts are in AI value chains that should be part of companies' risk assessments to help inform companies when they're undertaking that initial scoping out of risks and when they're conducting risk prioritization. So from the very beginning, that expert group that we consulted to develop our guidance, and our government delegates who also played a part in developing the guidance, reviewed what we set out as the most high priority risks and high priority labor and human rights impacts, and considered that risks related to data enrichment services to be extremely important and to be extremely significant for companies involved in the development and use of AI systems. And they also saw significant value in the Partnership on AI's work regarding data enrichment services, and that's actually addressed in the latest draft of our upcoming guidance. So our governments and our expert stakeholders really see value in this work, and they really see the importance of this issue as a priority topic for companies. In addition to our work on responsible AI, we also have over a decade of best practice with regards to responsible sourcing from other RBC projects that we can adapt and apply to sourcing from data enrichment services. Our extremely knowledgeable panel will be discussing some of those best practices today and challenges associated with them. Some topics I think are really important to highlight include the importance of a collaborative whole of supply chain approach to addressing certain types of impacts, the importance of stakeholder engagement, exercising leverage, both internal leverage and external leverage, and reconciling domestic legal requirements with international standards. And then, of course, overcoming challenges with connecting data enrichment sourcing with broader human rights due diligence processes, as Sonam correctly identified in her opening. So that's it from me now. That's what I hope to get into with our panel in our limited time together, and then I'll turn back to Sonam now and probably come back in later with some questions and observations. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Stephanie and Rashad, for your thoughtful comments. I think we've set up the conversation to talk a little bit about what's going on with data enrichment and some of our work, and now have the setup of the frameworks related to human rights and some of the work that OECD is spearheading. And we really hope to use the panel to bring everything together and start to think through some of the practical challenges that the industry is facing, and bringing everything together and figuring out a path forward. So to that end, we'll have a short panel now with 4 speakers, which we are very, very excited to have. And for reference, we've brought people together who have different approaches and different perspectives. And so I hope that that'll lead to a rich conversation. But we have Dunstan Allison Hope, who was formerly at BSR and is an independent consultant right now, which we are very excited to have. And also we have Elizabeth Watkins from Intel, and Antonia Patterson from Google DeepMind, and Fisher from Cisco. And everyone kind of is positioned differently within their organizations, and that'll come out a little bit. But I think that that's kind of what's needed to move forward in this with this set of challenges. So just to get started, I'll ask the first question of Dunstan. Given all of your experience in the human rights world and field, I'm curious what you think is the role of human rights risk assessments in AI and machine learning more broadly, and in particular, how might these be useful in tackling challenges related to improving conditions for data enrichment workers?
Great. Well, thanks, Sonam. This is Dunstan. Thank you for the invitation to participate today. I think this is a very important and timely discussion. It's been bubbling for a while, so I'm pleased to see so many participants today. So Sonam mentioned I'm an independent consultant today. I work at the intersection of business and technology and human rights. So in very practical terms, that has meant helping companies implement the UN guiding principles that Stephanie introduced and the OECD guidelines that Rashad introduced just now. So my work has been to put that work into practice with companies. And at this point, I've probably been involved in about 120 or so human rights assessments of different shapes and sizes, different focused areas, different challenges we're seeking to address. And when I take a step back and think about, well, what are the benefits of a human rights-based approach? What are the benefits of a human rights assessment? I could talk for a long time about that, but there are 3 things that really come to mind for me. First is that we consider potential impacts across all human rights set out in international human rights instruments. And that means we're making use of a well-established, pre-existing, credible taxonomy and are very complete in our analysis. We're not going to miss things, right? So if you're undertaking a human rights assessment, you are reviewing impacts against all human rights that exist across all human rights instruments. So it's a very complete assessment. And often I find with these assessments, the impacts you hadn't thought of before you started are some of the most important things that come out of it. Second is that we focus on the needs and interests of rights holders who are at greatest risk of being adversely impacted, those who are most vulnerable to impacts. And we take this very sort of people-centered approach to doing this assessment. There's lots of management speak, there's lots of process, but actually this is about real people who are being impacted by actions and decisions made by companies. So human rights assessment really forces you to take that human and people-centered approach. And then thirdly, a human rights assessment requires that we identify the most appropriate action for the company and all sorts of other actors to take to avoid, to prevent, to mitigate, or to remedy adverse impacts. And that term appropriate action has some very specific meaning in the UN Guiding Principles, but it doesn't come from a pre-existing checklist. We're not turning up and saying, here are the things that companies have to do. Rather, it really varies on a case-by-case basis according to the best way of achieving the desired outcomes for those who are impacted. And this sort of case-by-case approach, not coming with a pre-existing checklist, thinking about how to achieve impact in this particular case, is something I know the panelists that are coming after me will be able to speak about in terms of data enrichment workers and their experience trying to apply some existing industry guidelines to this quite different context. Hopefully that sets the scene for the benefits of human rights-based approach. Back to you, Sona.
Thank you. Yeah, and to that end, to get a little bit into the weeds, I'll ask Fisher, as someone who is actively working on a human rights team at a company and thinking about how to address issues related to responsible data enrichment practices. From your perspective, what are some of the benefits of using a human rights lens for companies to start thinking about their data enrichment practices or organization-wide?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Fisher Heimberger, and I work for Cisco. I'm a human rights program manager. I'll do my little intro here. I'm based in California, so the rising sun is also highlighting the hairs that are out of place. So forgive me that. But I work on the business and human rights team at Cisco, which reports up through legal. And our team has two main functions. The first is to set and carry out our global human rights policy across our global operations. And then the second is to ensure compliance with human rights regulations around the globe. And I wanted to highlight that because I think we'll get into why the human rights component is key. So I'm just going to point to what our team does there. And I'm going to be speaking from that perspective of a business and human rights team, which might be different from other human rights practitioners. That's some of the beauty of our field, is everyone has a slight different lens, perspective, and approach to bring to the conversation. Why are we here in particular? Cisco has been working with PAI in that community of practice on data enrichment workers in general, but we've also recently completed a human rights impact assessment, like Dunstan was talking about, on data enrichment workers as they pertain to Cisco, trying to understand what type of leverage, responsibility, and opportunities do we have in this space. And that's kind of emerging research that we're trying to connect the dots to. Hence why these conversations are both opportunities for us to share, but really to learn, to take back, and to try to turn that into concrete action. To answer your question, though, what are the benefits of a human rights lens? I think one of the key pieces of this is a human rights lens, and I'll say the business and human rights lens is really to operationalize the UN guiding principles and the OECD guidelines. I mean, we have these international frameworks that have been agreed upon, have been tested and tried, and are continuing to evolve, and we can apply that in these nuanced cases like data enrichment workers. This is critical because a lot of the spaces that human rights people, practitioners work in are complicated and nuanced. Data enrichment work is a great example of this. It's multi-tiers. There's all different types of actors across different geographies. Measuring your responsibility and the role that you've had in a data enrichment supply chain is complicated, and it can lead to a lot of paralysis on not knowing where to start, where to take action, and what your responsibility is in that supply chain. And that's where that human rights lens really comes in. It gives you this framework and this lens to both understand where are we as a company. I can speak to that. Where are we as a company? What's our responsibility, and what actions can we actually take? So I'll highlight just three, I think, big benefits from this lens. The first, which has been talked about, is due diligence. I mean, under the UN guiding
We go
principles
here.
and the
Oh, here.
OECD guidelines, I'll pause for just a second. And the OECD guidelines, due diligence is the central line behind all of that. Are we doing the research? Are we putting the work in to understand where adverse impacts are and where the risks exist? So key, it teaches us how can we actually go in and do that? How can we engage with stakeholders? How can we engage with rights holders? How can we make sure that the voices that are often not heard are being heard? And how can we make sure that the vulnerable communities that need to be centered are centered in this conversation? But then in addition to that, a human rights lens teaches us to understand what's our relationship to these risks. We use a cause, contribute, and linked framework under the UN guiding principles. And I won't go into all the details on what that means, but it's a measure of what is our relationship to a risk and our obligation for enacting action and change. There's a difference between if company A is causing a bunch of risks versus company A is hiring or paying company B, who is hiring and paying company C, who is causing risks and challenges. A human rights lens reminds you that there is still an obligation and a responsibility because you are linked or involved in these types of risks and impacts. So it helps you connect those dots. Where we're doing the due diligence, and then where is our relationship in this complicated space? One last piece, the second one I'll say on this is saliency. It's a big human rights word that we use all the time. In reality, it's a measure of the likelihood and the severity of potential adverse risks. This is important because you cannot prioritize human rights. There's not one human right that's more important than another. You can't tell that to somebody. That's just not how human rights work. But we do need to find a way to prioritize where we put our actions and our resources and our attention first. That's where saliency comes in. We've identified our risks through our due diligence. Now we need to think through, okay, where should we start first? In this space like data enrichment workers, that's key because it is complicated, because there's so many moving pieces. You need to start somewhere, and a human rights lens gives you that framework and the tools to actually take action. The last and little final thing I'll mention is a human rights lens, specifically a business and human rights lens, reminds you that you're taking action in these spaces isn't just the right thing to do. There's also a business case there. I really loved that Sonam pointed towards budding research on how respecting the rights of data enrichment workers, it's seen that it's leading to better data and better data enrichment, and therefore it's also better for the company itself. There'll be more to learn about that and to understand, how are these pieces connected. But a business and human rights lens brings this case that's okay. It's the right thing to do. We have people that we need to respect and make sure that they're being treated equitably. In addition to that, there's a business case here, and there's also legal risks. To link it all the way back to being on the legal team, with emerging regulations, the human rights lens teaches you that there's things you got to do if you want to continue to operate. So in summary, human rights lens gives you the framework and the tools to take action instead of being overwhelmed by the complicatedness of all the different networks and people that are involved in these spaces. And I'll pass it back to you, Sona.
Thanks, Fisher. Yeah. And I think to maybe complicate the picture a little bit, a lot of this work, it's also happening outside of human rights functions right now. And so I think there's some bridging work that needs to happen there as well. But I'm curious from your perspective, Antonia, as someone who sits on a responsible AI team that's been very transparent about your data enrichment practices and prioritizing responsible data enrichment practices. If you can share a little bit about why this is a priority, even from a different lens, a different perspective, and why other teams might want to prioritize this.
Great. Yeah. So firstly, I'll introduce myself.
So my name is Antonia. I work at Google DeepMind as part of our responsible development innovation team. And within this, I'm part of the kind of operational ethics and safety team. And that term operational would be relatively important here. So broadly, we work with teams across the organization to kind of assess the real world impacts of their models. And to do so, we often use a human rights lens, among others, to kind of really highlight where risks exist. I mean, ultimately, our work is to ensure that we align with our AI principles, which very much starts with the data we use to train our models, which is why we partnered so closely with PAI to operationalize the recommendations laid out in what generally feels to me like that seminal white paper. But going back to your question, I want to caveat that when we took on the task of operationalizing the recommendations originally, we already had a kind of IRB style review committee in place for behavioral research studies. So we therefore had a kind of institutional foundation from which to build this out, where we then kind of shifted towards looking at data enrichment studies. But with regards to making this a kind of organizational priority, there are many ways of framing this in order to kind of build buy-in on multiple levels. So thinking both kind of bottom up on a researcher perspective, but also top down from a leadership perspective. So when thinking about researchers, illuminating the all kind of too opaque system that existed and highlighting the impact that their decisions can have on kind of human welfare is obviously a very compelling argument. But one challenge like we've often faced in a responsibility function is that those kind of conversations about ethics can be very charged and need to be handled like delicately. And so it's really helpful to use kind of multiple approaches. So framing this really as a data quality issue can be equally as compelling to researchers. So the challenge is kind of overcoming the uplift in time and effort it might be required to submit an application for review or set up a pilot experiment, and generally to take a kind of more mindful approach. But if by doing so, we're able to kind of collect high quality data and reduce the number of collections required and stuff, you are ultimately saving yourself both time and money. I think also just by providing researchers with space, within a kind of application process, to think about like who really is annotating their data, we're likely kind of to reduce stuff like unintended biases and therefore further enhance data quality. And when thinking about building this as a priority from leadership, I think although it's kind of a knee-jerk reaction that increasing the time taken to collect data and increasing the cost of human data studies is to kind of assume an increase in overall cost, but the same principle applies here with the need to communicate the actual impact on bottom lines when this results in better performing and better safety aligned models in the long term. I think lastly, I mean, there's been no shortage of, as you say, adverse media coverage of some of the really devastating impacts that poor conditions for data enrichment workers has had in recent years. And although a harrowing read, the narrative has also been useful to point to when seeking leadership buy-in, not wanting to contribute privately or be shamed publicly for having any kind of role in that kind of transgression.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think it's helpful to hear from different sort of functions as well as to how you might approach this and think about this. And to that end, I think it's also helpful to hear from Elizabeth because you sit kind of in the middle where you've had interaction on responsible business practices and sort of traditional supply chains, but also are very grounded in responsible AI and research and have a social science background. And so I'm curious, given the different types of ways in which you've approached this and different types of teams that you've worked with, what do you see as the role of, I guess, different actors within companies, and how should they maybe be working together to push for better or more responsible data enrichment practices?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Sonam, and all the organizers for putting this together. I also want to thank my fellow panelists. I think everything that we are bringing to this conversation fits together very well and is very complementary because it seems like we each have a different piece of this conversation. So to intro, hi everybody, my name's Elizabeth. Like Sonam said, I'm both a research scientist, I'm a social scientist by training, and I sit in Intel labs and work with research teams. Typically, I'm doing human-centered research, examining things like trust and transparency and explainability, largely around AI deepfake detection and AI in manufacturing. But I also sit on the Responsible AI Council, which is an org-wide governance body that works together with our legal and privacy teams to take a look at all of the AI systems and solutions that are being developed across Intel, across all of our BUs. So having those two different hats is a really virtuous cycle because I can see different stages of the development chain and the development cycle and start to see how the intersections between those different phases could use improvement and provide opportunities for us to uplift. And coming into this conversation today and talking about human rights, I'm really proud of the history of Intel. Intel has a really long history of doing due diligence around human rights, particularly around human rights in our supply chain for things like conflict minerals. We're a hardware manufacturer. We deal with minerals and with people who work in mines and people who work in factories. So Intel has like 20 years of experience doing this kind of due diligence around human rights for people who are doing work where their rights are impacted and really severely impacted. And so we're bringing that history into this conversation and into this new space of data enrichment. And this is both an opportunity and a challenge because as we look at the ways that human rights abuses were happening in supply chains for conflict minerals, and the way that human rights violations are described around data enrichment, those headlines are very similar. People are being abused and oppressed and suffering oppressions to their rights in similar ways. And so we've been working with the Responsible Business Alliance, of which we're a founding member, to try to apply some of the tools that we've built over the years of human rights due diligence in conflict minerals, trying to apply those tools to the data enrichment space. And one of those tools is a self-assessment questionnaire. And this gives us an opportunity to start to do some mapping. And I really love, Fisher, how you talked about like what are the tools and the lenses that we can use to get our arms around this space, to start to draw some connections. And so looking at what our own practices are internally was a really important first step to figure out how is it that we're actually buying data enrichment work? Who do we talk to? Who does this buying? Are they talking to the people that we already have in place to do human rights, like vendor examinations, like building vendor supplier lists and approved supplier lists, bringing human rights expertise to supply chains? And so we got the opportunity to have a lot of conversations with people across product and research and governance and compliance and privacy and legal. And it turns out there was just so much heterogeneity. Even within one company, everyone is doing something different. Everyone has a different process. Everyone has a different risk appetite. Everyone is working with different business unit specific attorneys, which determines their risk appetite. Everyone has a different orientation to approved vendor supplier lists. There's a particularly stark division between people who sit in products and people who sit in research. People who sit in products, typically there's a longer institutional memory around how to purchase things and how to use approved vendor supplier lists. But when it comes to research, that kind of memory and that kind of crystallized process and codified process just isn't there. And so as we were talking to teams and we'd say things like, how do you think about potential human rights abuses in the way that you buy data enrichment and labeling services? And of course, everyone wants to do the right thing, but they're not always in that place to do the right thing, or they're not necessarily incentivized to expend that time, like Antonia was mentioning, or to spend those resources on doing the right thing at the right time. And so a lot of people that we talked to would end up saying something like, oh, I never even thought there might be human rights abuses. Am I contributing to that? And we said, well, that's what we're trying to figure out. Did you do any due diligence around your supplier? And they'd say, oh, well, we have a budget and the research budget sits on this platform and we send instructions to our manager on what kind of data labeling we want. And then the manager works with the platform. So we don't actually know what kinds of conversations are happening. We don't really know what that contract looks like. We don't know what those requirements look like. So we were really taken aback at just how much heterogeneity, how much variability there is, even just within one company.
Yeah, I think that that kind of points to some of the uncertainty here in terms of how to move forward, because especially at larger companies, there's a lot of disparate threads and different priorities, right? And so, somewhat related, but I'm curious, Dunstan, sort of trying to tie these pieces together and what might create more sort of incentives as well to create alignment internally at companies. I'm curious, you recently wrote a piece on the corporate sustainability due diligence directive, and we've talked about a couple of different approaches now, but if we want to get into a conversation about broader governance and regulation and the role that different types of regulations might play in sort of standardizing processes, can you share a little bit about the CS Triple D, which will is a little bit easier to say going forward, but what role that can play in shaping the obligations of companies, and in particular in addressing the conditions for data enrichment workers in the supply chain, and kind of curious how to put this in the scope of the CS Triple D, because it isn't, I'm not sure it's necessarily called out, but might be a potential way of impact.
Yeah, good question. And let me start by saying I've learned a lot just by listening to my three prior panelists in terms of how this plays out in practice inside companies. And some of the things that came to mind to me about the CS Triple D is very much characterized by Elizabeth, your comments about how you've experienced this inside Intel. So I've learned a lot from just listening to my fellow panelists just now. So to date, human rights due diligence in technology companies has often been divided by those examining the impacts of product use downstream and those looking at labor standards in supply chains upstream. That's a slight exaggeration and simplification is more nuanced there than I've characterized, but I think people will recognize that distinction. There's been assessments looking at products being used downstream, assessments at labor standards upstream, but less connectivity between the two. And my sense is that the task of assessing the risks associated with data enrichment workers has fallen between those two sort of upstream and downstream segments because it carries features of both of them. It involves a mix of different functions, and those functions might be quite different than those that have typically looked at upstream risks, while those looking at downstream risks haven't necessarily been attentive to upstream risks. So I think one opportunity with the CS Triple D, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, and it would also point you to its sibling, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or CSRD, is that they apply both upstream and downstream and will require more holistic and joined up approaches. Now, there is a debate about the extent to which the CS Triple D will apply downstream, but my reading of it is it absolutely does cover impacts on data enrichment workers. I would need a compelling case to convince me otherwise. So my hope is that in the quest for completeness, for the quest of not being caught out missing something when seeking compliance with the CS Triple D, that should increase the likelihood of risks associated with data enrichment workers being properly captured by CS Triple D compliance. In my mind, at least, there's not a scope question there. It's about doing a full and proper, complete assessment of compliance. I think the bigger question on my mind is how we make sure that compliance with the CS Triple D isn't just a paper exercise of compliance with the letter of the law, where you simply record the things that you're already doing anyway, but becomes a meaningful exercise of compliance with the spirit of the law and actually pays attention to what we're really seeking to achieve here, which is positive change on and for the lives of workers. And so the thing I'm paying most attention to with the CS Triple D is less around scope, but there's important discussions to be had there, but more, how do we harness it for the desired outcomes we want to achieve, and think about the spirit of its application and how to make sure we bring some of the things that Stephanie and Rashad mentioned about established standards of international responsible business conduct to that exercise.
Yeah, this actually ties maybe nicely into a follow-up for Fisher. I think one of the things that Dunstan just brought up is how like our conceptualization of data enrichment workers might be challenging our existing tools, right? It's maybe falling in between two different approaches that might have applied for different types of supply chains. I'm curious what you might see as useful analogs from other fields or other supply chains that we can be looking to understand how to approach data enrichment practices in particular, and what what analogs can we use, but also what adjustments do we need to make in order to better understand how to treat data enrichment work within the supply chain.
Yeah, it's a great question and a very good flow. It's almost like there's some expert moderation going on here, bringing together all these questions. Yeah, and I appreciate both what Dunstan was saying and also what Elizabeth was saying about some of the learnings from direct supply chain or conflict minerals, for example. I think I'll get into that. And so what I can share is some of the findings from our human rights impact assessment, which is a little Cisco specific, but I think these lessons can be learned for all. But is there were some broad categories where we found a lot of risks existing. And you'll read these in the white paper that PAI has put out, and this is in that research. But you have risks that are pretty analogous to supply chain, direct supply chain, what I'll say. That's lower wages, variable work, lack of traditional benefits, maybe excessive working hours. These are risks that data enrichment workers may face that are similar to what you could find in a hardware supply chain, both in the factory level and manufacturing level, down to actually the raw materials. The other bucket that I think you would find a lot of analogous risk to is risks similar to those you might find in content moderation. And that's that more kind of online side. That's the mental and physical stress. An example of that might be exposure to traumatic or graphic material. If you're doing red teaming data enrichment, for example, and you're asking people to generate prompts to break an AI model, GAI model, for example, by doing some some pretty intense things, or asking the AI to do some graphic things or to show graphic things. That can be a lot. And there are some risks there that are analogous to that content moderation. So what I'll say is both of those areas, direct supply chain, content moderation, have pretty robust research in how to mitigate those risks. Um, doesn't mean it's succeeded yet. I'll give that caveat for sure. This is an ongoing conversation, but we're not starting from nothing. And I think if you learn and try to take in those best practices, some of those leadership examples, some of those tools that have been created for direct supply chain and content moderation, you can stand on those shoulders and actually have some place to start. And so it's a great opportunity to have those lessons learned. Of course, because my favorite word of the day is complicated, it's a little bit more complicated than that. And so to complicate that narrative, with the direct supply chain, some of those mitigation efforts that we might do could be, for example, posting workers' rights on a factory floor, or ensuring different safety equipment, depending on what the task is. Now, in the work of data enrichment workers, it's not really site specific. It can be anywhere in terms of different platforms. It can be people working from their homes for a short period and then pivoting to another task. And so some of those more traditional mitigation efforts for lower wages, variable work, lack of traditional benefits can be a little more challenging to put into place. But the leverage that we have from the direct supply chain on working with suppliers, working with, down to the raw materials, and understanding, once again, kind of that human rights lens of where is our responsibility and what can we as a company or any other actor advocate for at what point of the supply chain does come true. And I think that's a key area. One other complication to pull out on maybe ways that we need to make an adjustment is exactly what Elizabeth pointed to, which is data enrichment comes in many shapes and sizes. On the company side, which is what I can speak to, like Elizabeth, the request for data enrichment is really different depending on the task, the team, where it's being, the finances are coming from. And so creating a policy, even on a company level, is way more challenging than we might have thought originally, because there's so many moving pieces, and it does it does kind of fall through the crack of, okay, supply chain. So you might be thinking supplier code of conduct, for example, on a company side. Let's borrow that in, but it's more complicated than that because it's not site specific. Okay, so then if it's not that, maybe it's just a responsible AI developing policy. But that has a lot more to do with the outputs and maybe how a product is going to be used or tested, and it falls through with the labor that comes through from the supplier code of conduct. And so finding those bridges between, you know, direct supply chain, content moderation, responsible AI, finding those bridges and those points is critical because it gives you the chance to use the best practices and knowledge that's already been gleaned, but also recognize those differences. And I think I'll just summarize by this type of event is incredible because we're bringing in those different perspectives. We're bringing in those different expertise to identify those bridges, both from the corporate side, from a civil society side, from an academia side, from people who are data enrichment workers themselves, all of that coming together. I think that's where that key is going to be. But for now, we have lessons learned, we have things to do differently, and we're just trying to come up with the right equation to put those together. Thank you.
And I know Antonia has to leave a little bit early, so last question kind of does come off of what you just said. What, as you know, as a company that's implemented some of these practices, can you share some of your learnings and things that are challenges that other teams maybe should be cognizant of that you've learned through practice?
Yes, certainly. And yeah, I'll definitely be reflecting a lot of what the comments that Fisher has made. I wouldn't say any of these challenges are necessarily unanticipated, but I think one of the biggest challenges is always scale. Like, we have grown significantly in size as a company since publishing our best practices, and that always is going to put pressure on any processes that you've put in place. We have a kind of a dedicated human data team who I work with like regularly to kind of update or try and streamline these reviews, but there's always a risk that something slips through the cracks, and we are diligent on, you know, trying to put the mitigation measures in place to reduce this risk. But when, to use that awful phrase, the only organizational constant is change, it's difficult to kind of set up processes or set them in stone or ever really feel confident. Although I would say that's probably a good thing because, you know, you remain vigilant. But like, also as we scale, the types of data that we are trying to collect, you know, that might change over time. So different provisions may then need to be put in place or agreed with vendors to try and protect workers against like this ever-changing risk landscape. I think lastly, you know, it's all well and good to have these principles in place or, like, you know, other kind of supplier policies in place. But if you don't have real visibility over how they're being upheld by partners, then it can sometimes going to act as a moral buffer. So I think this is why kind of PAI's community of practice has been really trying to combat this by putting together those vendor engagement guidelines and transparency reporting documents, and that will really help like AI developers like us to really try and close that gap. And I know that Eliza has shared those in the chat, so I would implore everyone to take a read. And thank you so much for having me on this panel. I do have to jump off, but it's been a real pleasure to listen to you all, and I'll see you all again soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us. Yeah, Elizabeth, turning over to you also kind of on this question around challenges. What have been some of the challenges that you've been facing? And you've kind of touched on this a little bit before, but maybe like what would make it easier, I guess? What do you think would help you bring these different threads together as you're advancing these practices?
Yeah, I don't think I'm going to say anything new. I think everyone on this panel has been very emphatic about the fact that this is an ecosystem level problem and the fact that it's going to take everybody. And I think, Fisher, I think you described it really well, talking about like the intangibility and the immateriality of data enrichment services. Like, it's hard to get our arms around. It's not like minerals. It's, you know, measuring the hours, Fisher, like you were describing, like dictating that a person cannot be forced to work more than 10 hours a day is different when someone's in a factory versus when someone's working at home, and when someone can juggle like many different types of gigs as they jump from platform to platform. So it's the fact that this is it's a supply chain issue. Things can get abstracted. Knowledge can get lost. Knowledge can get erased as things pass from phase to phase and from actor to actor. And so the comfort I take from this is that the shape of this as an ecosystem level problem points to the shape that needs to define the solution, that this needs to be an ecosystem level solution. We all need to join together in order to address this. And I've been really heartened to hear, as I've been learning about the history of human rights due diligence at Intel and spending time with people who have been here for decades and have a long history in doing this work. Some of the examples that I've heard around doing what's called pre-competitive standards and bringing all companies together to decide we as an industry are not going to tolerate these kinds of abuses, and enforcing that the entire industry of data enrichment purchasers are aligned and together in setting standards for what's not acceptable, and having that kind of ecosystem level approach, particularly with the involvement of leadership, when leadership can communicate to all aspects of a business, including neighbors in that supply chain, from customers to vendors. Exercising that kind of leadership to enforce an industry-wide change, I think, is something that something that we need to help us move forward.
Thank you. I think that does sort of bring a call to action, and there's a lot of hard work needed to sort of do that and build that ecosystem level solution, probably multiple solutions and approaches.